Well, good evening and welcome to the 8th and final program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2021 8-week Great Decisions series, the topic suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Michael Vendetta, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council. And on behalf of my colleague, Erica Kubik, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, I welcome all of you tonight. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope that you will stay safe and show grace to those in your community. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the help of 50 local companies, 11 educational partners, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, that is objective, that is relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. And you can learn more about us at worldmichigan.org. We're very grateful to our series sponsor, Wolverine Worldwide. Thank you to them for all 8 of these Great Decisions programs, and to Blue Lake Radio and to the Community Media Center as media sponsors. After Mr. Lippman's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. You may type them into the YouTube comments section, or you may text them to 616-308-6560. We ask that you remember our house rules to show civility to our guests and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. We are pleased to have Mr. Thomas Lippman with us, and we are grateful to him for flexibility to engage us in this format. Mr. Lippman is the author of numerous magazine articles, book reviews, and columns about Mideast affairs, and he's the author of 8 books. His most recent book, this one, is Crude Oil, Crude Money, Aristotle Onassis, Saudi Arabia, and the CIA. And it tells the very interesting story of how American oil companies teamed up with the CIA and the Department of State to thwart the plans of Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, who almost managed to reshape the Middle East. Mr. Lippman is a Columbia University graduate, is a former Middle East bureau chief of the Washington Post, and he has served as the newspaper's oil and energy reporter. He is currently a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, where he serves as principal media contact on Saudi Arabia and U.S. Saudi relations. His presentation tonight is the Saudi-Arabian U.S. relationship, decades in the making, and we are delighted to welcome Thomas Lippman. Tom, welcome to this gathering of West Michiganders.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you. And I'd like to begin, as I do most of the times when I address an audience of people who don't know me, with just a few words of the way I approach this and what I'd like you to think about. First of all, when you're talking about Saudi Arabia, if you think like an American, you will get it wrong. That is to say, if you assume that the Saudi response to any given set of inputs is what yours or ours would be, you are as likely to be wrong as right. They're a different kind of society, and they see things differently. Second, I don't talk or speculate about internal royal family politics. Nobody knows, and those who know don't talk about it. And finally, I never use the term reform when I'm talking about Saudi Arabia. Reform implies improvement, and we don't have the moral standing anymore to lecture the Saudis about how they should organize their society, and they're not amenable to input from a place that has school shootings. And so our sense of what might be an improvement isn't necessarily the same as theirs. And I don't put it in terms of reform. That being said, let's get on to the subject at hand. I was the Post Middle East correspondent in the second half of the 1970s. And much of my time, as you may remember, some of you will remember, was taken up with the Sadat Peace Initiative and peace between Israel and Egypt. But I did spend some time in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was a big part of the importance to the region. And of course, those were the days when OPEC was riding very, very high, and OPEC meetings were front page news. The price of oil in the decade of the 1970s went from about $2.25 to about $31. And the Saudis were a big part of that. But I didn't know it intimately. And my own Arabic, such as it was Egyptian colloquial, which meant that all around the Gulf, people could understand my questions, but I couldn't understand their answers. And so my conversations were more or less limited to people who spoke English or French. But then after 9/11, I realized that most Americans knew very little about Saudi Arabia. They knew that Saudi Arabia had oil and people dressed funny and women couldn't drive, but they didn't really know anything about Saudi Arabia, and they had no social, cultural, or ancestral ties to Saudi Arabia or to the Arabs in general. And you were forever seeing pictures that showed anywhere you went in Saudi Arabia, you did indeed see things that looked to us bizarre. Erica, perhaps you could show that picture now, just to give folks an idea what I'm talking about. This is a random scene at a shopping mall in Saudi Arabia. This gentleman is taking those ladies' picture. What for? I mean, what is the point? And you just see stuff that looks weird to us all the time, although less so now than you did 30 or so, 40 years ago. So you ask yourself then, how did the world's greatest industrial power and the world's most influential democracy get into this improbable partnership with a faraway, little-known country that was created as a unified nation only in 1932? A country that at the time it became the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had no roads, little electricity, no airports, few schools, and in fact, most of the people were illiterate. Most places didn't have running water, and it had no resources. Its greatest source of revenue was a tax on the pilgrims who went to Mecca every year for the Hajj. And in the 1930s, shortly after the founding King Abdulaziz ran the flag up for the first time, the pilgrimage revenue dried up in the Great Depression because people couldn't travel. And so the country really was destitute. Abdulaziz took it over, but he gained a prize of dubious value. Now, I don't want to get into the internal power struggles between the king and the fanatics who were even more xenophobic and anti-foreign than he was. But the king, having established his authority, knew that he was going to need outside help, economic and technical help, if he was going to make anything of this new country. And he was deeply suspicious of the British because they were colonialists, and they ran the nearby Gulf sheikdoms around Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Egypt. And they had a long history of colonialism in the Arab world, and the king was very suspicious of that. So he was, however, favorably inclined to the United States. And why was that? Well, long before he became king in 1911, 10 of his warriors were wounded in a gun battle, and they crossed into Bahrain, where there was a missionary hospital operated by the Reformed Church in America. And at that hospital, there were doctors who spoke Arabic and they were able to set up a hospital there because the British were in charge, and they weren't afraid of Protestant missionaries. So they set up a hospital. And when Abdulaziz's soldiers went back to Saudi Arabia, they talked about the modern medical care they had, something they had never seen before. And not long afterwards, in 1913, a local potentate in the eastern part of the country, where the oil fields are now, invited the hospital to send a doctor to the mainland. And Dr. Paul Harrison, fluent in Arabic, spent 6 weeks there treating the locals for tuberculosis, malaria, trachoma, and other diseases for which there had previously been no useful medical treatment. And a year later, the king sent a group of his soldiers to Kuwait. They had malaria. He sent them to Kuwait and asked the ruler of Kuwait to bring another doctor from the hospital in Bahrain. Long story short, when the king himself got sick, he invited doctors from that hospital to come in, and they spent several years roaming the land. And this is long before oil, giving without taking, teaching by example. They did not proselytize because that would not have been acceptable, but they created an environment of people who saw generosity from Americans who gave without taking. And it reinforced the king's desire to deal business with the Americans and not the British. Enter a man named Charles Crane, the plumbing fixtures heir. You can still see Crane plumbing fixtures in any restroom. Crane wasn't interested in his family's business. He didn't care about bathtubs and sinks. He had gotten interested in the Middle East because President Wilson had appointed him as the co-chair of what was known as the King Crane Commission after World War I, when it was time to parcel out the pieces of the Ottoman Empire, which had died in the war, with the war. And the King Crane Commission was sent by Woodrow Wilson to try to figure out what to do with Palestine. And he got interested in the Middle East. And so he made it his mission to contribute to the development of the countries on the Arabian Peninsula. And he helped build the first substantial steel bridge in Yemen. And he then sent an engineer from Vermont named Carl Twitchell to go to Saudi Arabia. And Twitchell spent quite some time roaming the country, roaming the Arabian Peninsula, looking basically for water. And he then met the king and had to give him the bad news that he hadn't found any substantial amounts of water. Saudi Arabia is about 75% desert wasteland. But Twitchell told the king that he had seen oil domes in the eastern province that were similar to the geological structures that were producing oil in Bahrain, where oil was already coming out. And so the king sought bidders for an oil concession in Saudi Arabia. There were two bidders, the American Oil Company, Standard of California, or Chevron, and a British syndicate. And the king went with his instincts, and he also knew that Chevron needed the oil. Chevron was, in international terms, crude short. They didn't have their own dedicated reserves of oil the way Standard Oil did, or Shell. And so Chevron was looking for oil that would be all theirs. And the king was looking for people who'd need the oil right away and start sending money ASAP, which the British didn't need the oil because they controlled the oil in Iran and Iraq. So he gave the concession to Standard Oil of California, 60 years of an exclusive concession to explore for, find, develop, transport, and process oil if they found any in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. In 1933, the end of that same year when the contract was signed, the first Americans arrived on the shore of what's now the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia. They set up their own little tent city there, which gradually became a resident community of actual buildings. And they went to work looking for oil. It took them 5 years to find oil in commercial quantities. But when they did, it was clear that they had made a serious finding. And the first oil for export went aboard a ship and was exported in 1939. The kingdom was really in terrible shape. There was starvation in the hinterlands because there was no money. And it would be really important to get the flow of revenue started. And of course, September of 1939, when the first oil cargo went out, guess what happened? World War II started. Disrupted sea lanes, you couldn't get machinery, you couldn't get equipment. And most of the Americans went home, leaving a token representation, a group of 100 people known as the 100 Men in a caretaker capacity. The revenue was cut off again to Saudi Arabia. And basically, they went on the dole to the U.S. government. Later, at this point, when this World War II started, the United States had recognized the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but had no official representation there. No U.S. government officials, no embassy, no consulate, no diplomats. But as the war went on, it became clear that Saudi Arabia was taking on an importance beyond what it had intrinsically at the time. First, the United States military wanted an air base there because they were fighting a two-front war, and the British would not let American bombers use the air base in Bahrain, peculiar kind of allies. So they wanted an air base, and the king was very reluctant to grant that because it smacked to colonialism to him. At this point, later in the war, enter a man named William Alfred Eddy, a man with whose life I'm quite familiar because I wrote a biography of him. And it's an excellent book. You should all buy many copies of it. Anyway, Bill Eddy was a United States Marine. He'd been born in Lebanon to missionary parents. He was a fluent speaker of Arabic from childhood. All his playmates in the streets of Sidon were Arab children. He had later he was a Marine in World War I, an intelligence officer. He later got his PhD from Princeton, and he taught at Dartmouth and was an original member of the faculty at the American University in Cairo, where he added Egyptian dialect to his Lebanese Arabic. He then became president of Hobart and William Smith Colleges in upstate New York. He hated that. He was a man of action, and that didn't mean the ladies' auxiliary lunches up there in upstate New York. So when World War II was looming, Eddy got himself reactivated in the Marine Corps, even though he had been badly wounded and walked with a permanent limp in World War I. And the Marine Corps seconded him to the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. He was the OSS point man on the ground in Morocco for the first Allied landings in Operation Torch in the 1940s. And he worked with the local people there, picked up Moroccan Arabic to go with his other Arabic. He then became minister plenipotentiary, they called it, in Saudi Arabia. His knowledge of Arabic ingratiated him with the king. He was very respectful. He was knowledgeable about and respectful of Islam. He succeeded in negotiating the air base agreement with the king. The king's price for the air base was the development of a national airline, a role that TWA took on. TWA had all kinds of people in an office building in Jeddah known as the Jolly Green Giant for many, many years. And it was Eddy who orchestrated the famous meeting of Abdulaziz and President Roosevelt in 1945. Roosevelt was interested in Saudi Arabia. He had flown over it on his way back from a conference in Tehran in 1943. He thought it might have agricultural potential. His Interior Department was making clear to him the importance that Saudi oil would have not long after the war. And he was interested in Saudi Arabia, and he wanted to meet the king. The king wanted to meet him. The king had sought Roosevelt's favor by sending him a collection of valuable, rare postage stamps from the Gulf region. Roosevelt was an avid stamp collector. And so when Roosevelt went to Yalta in February of 1945, just 2 months before his death, he arranged to meet 3 people afterwards on his cruiser, the HMS Quincy, anchored in the Suez Canal in the Great Bitter Lake. One of those people was the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. One was King Farouk of Egypt, and one was King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. This meeting has been much mythologized. And if you ask people, you'll say, oh yeah, that was the meeting where they did the famous oil for security deal. There was no oil for security deal. To this day, there's no formal security agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. They didn't talk about oil because the United States already had exclusive access to Saudi oil for 60 years. There was nothing to talk about, except when production could resume. What they talked about mostly was Palestine. The British had made clear that they were going to give up the Palestine mandate that they had received from the League of Nations after the war. What was going to become of Palestine? The Zionists wanted for the Zionist community, Jewish state. The Arabs didn't want that. The British were not allowing Jews into Palestine, even destitute Jewish refugees from the Nazis. And the fate of Palestine was going to be very, very difficult to resolve. And the king, of course, was resolutely, firmly, and entirely opposed to bringing any more Jews into Palestine. Roosevelt thought he could charm the king into acquiescence, or at least compromise on this matter. He was wrong. The king was adamant. And so they didn't make any progress on the Palestine issue except to reinforce the difficulty that they were going to have in finding out, in establishing what the future of Palestine was going to be. They also talked about the possibility of agricultural development in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the United States did send agricultural aid teams out there. And by the late 20th century, agriculture was the second largest component of GDP in Saudi Arabia after energy. But the king and FDR hit it off, and they no doubt would have made further progress in the relationship, except that Roosevelt died 2 months later. And Truman spent the first 3 years of his presidency grappling with the Palestine question. And basically, he had two kinds of advisors. He had all his international affairs advisors, State Department, intelligence agencies, and national security people, telling him of the importance of Palestine and seeing things the Arabs' way, and not letting the Jews take over. But he also had other advisors who were telling him that if he wanted to get reelected, he had to carry New York in the 1948 election, and he had to give the Jews what they wanted. And so FDR had won the king's favor. He gave him his spare wheelchair, and he gave him a DC-3, which became the king's personal plane. It had a rotating throne in it, so the king could always face Mecca. Truman didn't have that kind of relationship with the king and wasn't interested in that. All he wanted was to get the Palestine issue off his back. And so when he did two things. One was he declared Saudi Arabia eligible for U.S. military assistance, which was Congress enabled him to do. The other was he recognized Israel. As soon as the Israelis declared their independence, he recognized it. That recognition of Israel was the first of the many recurring crises in the relationship that had been established by the oil people and by Bill Eddy during World War II and by the Roosevelt-Aziz meeting. By the time Roosevelt's presidency ended, the United States was running the Saudi Arabian oil industry. Roosevelt had gotten the king to declare war on the Axis powers in the last 2 months of the war so that they could then join be a charter member of the United Nations. The United States soon thereafter had the air base there. The oil community resumed growth right after the war. Relations were moving along very nicely. Truman didn't care one way or another, except that he wanted the oil, but he had to do something about the Zionist issue. And so he recognized Israel, thereby infuriating King Abdulaziz. And that was the first of the many crises. And I'm just going to run down them here for a few minutes, just to give you an idea. That this relationship, strange as it seemed, has endured for 75 years, despite strains that probably would have disrupted relations with any other country. All the time it was developing strategically, it was also developing economically. American industrial giants such as GE and Bechtel became instrumental. They were the engines of Saudi Arabia's physical development of its infrastructure. And the relationship was very close, to the point where really neither side wished to disrupt it despite their disagreements. The 1948 recognition of Israel was the first of those. In 1953 came the Aristotle Onassis affair, which Michael has already mentioned. King Abdulaziz died. His successor, the dim-witted King Saud, gave Aristotle Onassis an exclusive contract to transport, for the sea transport of all oil coming out of Saudi Arabia, which would at transport rates he would set. Well, the United States Navy, which was buying a lot of its oil from Saudi Arabia, didn't want anything to do with Onassis transporting it, because he was under indictment in Washington at the time for defrauding the Navy. And so the State Department and the CIA ganged up on the king. They had to try to do it discreetly because they didn't want to permanently alienate the king. So by the time they worked that out, they found the Saudis were really angry about this. They cut off 0.4 economic assistance, the program that Truman had established, but they did not, neither side took steps to damage the relationship to beyond the immediate issue. In 1971, with the rise of OPEC, came the huge surge in oil prices that began to anger Americans. And then, of course, came the biggest crisis of all, the 1973 Middle East War, in which President Nixon publicly announced the United States was shipping arms to the Israelis, and the Saudis backed the Arabs. The Saudis then joined the Arab oil embargo against the United States and the Netherlands. You'll often hear it referred to as the OPEC embargo. There was no OPEC embargo. Several Arab members of OPEC cut off oil shipments to the United States. OPEC as an organization did not, and major members of OPEC such as Iran, Nigeria, and Indonesia continued to ship oil, same as always. But the Arabs had so much oil and shipped so much of it to the United States and to Europe through the port of Rotterdam that it disrupted economic life and the oil markets really all over the industrial world except for Japan. And Americans were furious at the Saudis for doing that. You can hear Henry Kissinger on tape referring to the Arabs as savages in his fury over the oil embargo. The oil embargo went on for about 6 months, and those long gas lines became like a permanent fixture of the American consciousness of the Saudis. In 1988, but as soon as the embargo ended, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia became closer than ever. When Nixon went to Saudi Arabia, his last hurrah, and established a joint economic commission in which for 25 years after that, American civil servants were seconded directly into the offices of their Saudi counterparts to teach the Saudis how to run a country. In 1988, the United States discovered accidentally that the Saudis had purchased nuclear-capable ballistic missiles from China. It was furious because anti-communism was one of the foundation stones of this partnership with Saudi Arabia. And the Chinese were communists, They had their own crews guarding those missiles. The Saudis refused to allow the Americans to inspect them. The Israelis were immediately alarmed because the missiles were nuclear capable. They had no other purpose. And in the end, Secretary of State Baker cut a deal with the Saudis in which we allowed them to keep the missiles in exchange for Saudi Arabia joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which up to that point it had refused to do. They said they would do it when Israel did it. And of course, Israel to this day has not become a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the Saudis did. In the 1990s, the United States nearly bankrupted Saudi Arabia by demanding that the Saudis pay cash for the cost of Operation Desert Storm. And the Saudis had to go into the international bond markets and borrow the money to pay the United States for Desert Storm. They didn't like that. Then, of course, came 9/11. And I don't need to elaborate on that. You know what the public response was about the Saudis and the infamous 15 of the 19 and all that, a deep suspicion that somehow the Saudi government had been complicit, or some people in the Saudi government had been complicit. As you know, the commission, the investigating commission, found no implication of the Saudis in any official capacity in the events of 9/11, but some people have remained angry about it and are still angry about it. In 2003, there was another dispute when the Saudis opposed the United States invasion of Iraq. I wish we had listened to them. They knew it was a bad idea and could see what would happen afterwards. In 2015, came the JCPOA, the International Nuclear Control Agreement with Iran. The fact that it put restrictions on the potential development of nuclear weapons in Iran ought to have been a comfort to the Saudis. But in fact, they saw it as the beginning of a rapprochement between Washington and Tehran. And that's what they were afraid of, and it's what they're most afraid of today. They knew that was not going to happen under Donald Trump. And then in 2018 came the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And so where we are now is that the strategic relationship, and by the way, the murder of Khashoggi came after 3 years of that relentless war in Yemen, in which the Saudis were the leading organizers and perpetrators, a war they cannot win and are not winning. So in some ways, it is and has always been business as usual with Saudi Arabia. The people are still selling equipment and weapons there. We've cut off support for the military adventure in Yemen. And President Biden has said, the White House has used the word recalibrate the relationship with Saudi Arabia. That does not mean break, disrupt, sever, or cut off. It means not do it the way Donald Trump did. Remember the illuminated orb, the scepter, the red carpet treatment that President Trump got on his first visit to outside the United States, which was not to a NATO ally or Canada, it was to Saudi Arabia. You're not going to see that anymore. I don't think you're going to see Mohammed bin Salman at the White House anytime soon. And President Biden has said that it's only appropriate for him to speak to the head of state, i.e. King Salman. He will not talk directly to the prince, and in fact has not done so. So that's where we are. The relationship still exists. The two basic rationales that held it up for all those years, the Cold War against the communists, that's over, and the need for oil. In effect, that's over. Since 2009, the biggest buyer of Saudi oil has been China. not the United States. Most of the oil we get from Saudi Arabia, the Saudis purchase themselves because they own the biggest refinery in the United States. So they buy oil to run through their own refinery. Nevertheless, Saudi remains a crucial component of the world economy because of oil, and has demonstrated itself to be a valuable partner in two important regional tasks: confronting Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and terrorism, and in confronting Iran. And so we will continue to do strategic and economic business with them. I'll be interested in two things. I'll be interested to see whom President Biden appoints as his ambassador there. But if you want to know what's going to happen next in the relationship, keep your eye on this. King Salman is an old man. He's even older than me. Oh, one of these years, he is going to die, and Mohammed bin Salman is going to become the king of Saudi Arabia, for better or worse. He's popular with young people in Saudi Arabia because of the way he has liberalized Saudi society. But the immediate question he will face is whom to appoint as his heir apparent and crown prince. And if there's going to be a split in the family, that's a moment to keep your eye on. So I'll stop there. I've talked enough. I'll be glad to hear from you. Try to answer any of your questions.
Wow, Tom, that was quite fascinating. Thank you very much. You covered a lot of territory, and then really interestingly mapped out how this relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have had many, many tension points since back in 1930s, and for matters of convenience and joint interest, there's not been a divorce. There's been a continuing contribution from each other. So they're very, very interesting. And I think West Michiganders were very interesting to hear you say that one of the very first occasions which drew the Saudis to the U.S. were Reformed Church of America missionary doctors in Bahrain. West Michigan is heavily RCA, Reformed Church of America, Dutch American. And that's a very interesting kind of a tweak in this relationship that I don't think many people knew. And thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Well, authors are not in the business of promoting other people's books. But if you're interested, there's a book called Doctors for the Kingdom, written by one of the Reformed Church doctor who served over there. And it's quite interesting. It will tell you the whole story.
Okay. Doctors of the Kingdom. Great. Some questions coming in. And again, you type them into the YouTube comments section, or you can text them to 616-308-6560. We'll get to as many as we can. What's the relationship with Jordan and the Saudi Arabian government? Interesting to see the context between other Gulf countries located between, Iran and Israel, other Gulf countries other than Iran. So Jordan or other Gulf countries, what are their relationships with Saudi Arabia?
Well, Jordan is a very interesting case for two reasons. Jordan, of course, has a peace treaty with Israel, which the Saudis are not prepared to do. On one level, the Saudis are very sympathetic to Jordan. It's a monarchy. There's even been talk about inviting Jordan to join the Gulf Cooperation Council. But the Saudis have also always been suspicious of Jordan because Jordan is the, get this, Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. The Hashemites were the Saudis' great rivals when they were trying to take control of the Hijaz early in the 20th century. The Hashemites lost that struggle, and the British gave them two consolation prizes, Jordan and Iraq, where they established Hashemite monarchies. The Saudis know that the Hashemites are still on the throne in Jordan, and it's always in the back of their minds.
Interesting. How does Saudi Arabia really view China? It's been a long relationship as well. You've made some reference to some of their interactions. Is it currently, is it a stronger relationship than the U.S.? Will Saudi Arabia play off China versus the U.S.?
This is a very interesting question that, frankly, I should know more about. Um, the Saudis, as I said, have a major market for their oil in Saudi Arabia. And like every other country, or almost every other country, they buy huge amounts of products from China. But China remains a communist country. Um, and China recently signed a 25-year agreement, a partnership agreement with the Iranians, which is not going to go over well in Riyadh, as you can imagine. And so I need to go back out there and ask some questions. It's a very interesting question. And uh, I can't go beyond that. They have an economic relationship, but I don't believe they have a political relationship. The Saudis know that the Chinese can build up their navy all they want. They are never going to provide the kind of security in the Gulf region that the United States provides with the Fifth Fleet. And so they're not going to have that kind of relationship with China.
So that, you could say in the long relationship with China and Saudi Arabia, there's these bumps along the road, just like there has been in the Saudi-U.S. relationship, but the Chinese don't have quite the depth of relationship, it sounds like.
Well, they don't, and it started much later. When King Saud came to Washington to meet Eisenhower. The Saudis wanted much more in the way of arms, weaponry, than the United States was willing to provide at the time. And one of the king's prominent advisors arranged a dinner party at which he let it be known that the Chi-Coms, the dread communist Chinese, had invited the crown prince to visit China. At that time, the Saudis had nothing to do with any communist country in any way, shape, or form. Well, that taboo subsequently broke down, of course, as it had to, when a market like China comes into develops. But it's never been the kind of intimate working partnership that they had with the Americans, and I don't see it becoming that. The Chinese are deeply invested in the Horn of Africa, and they have their own interests.
Well, and certainly this recent deal with Iran is going to create some barriers. Yeah. Right. There's a question about Yemen. Is there a particular reason for Saudi antipathy for Yemen? What's the source of this?
The Saudis are not antipathetic to the Yemenis. They're antipathetic to a group of rebels who are known as the Houthis, for the head of the organization, who are members of an offshoot of Shiism and aligned with the Iranians. I was in Saudi Arabia in 2009 when, out of the blue, there was a border war between Houthis on the Yemeni side and the Saudis, which didn't go well for the Saudis. It didn't last long. But that was the first anybody had heard of the Houthis, really. And it didn't make sense that they would try to provoke the Saudis. They had their hands full inside Yemen. But ever since then, the Saudis have seen the Houthis as a stalking horse for the Iranians. And as part of that so-called Shiite crescent that runs from Yemen to Bahrain to Iran and now around to Lebanon and includes Azerbaijan, I think, which the Saudis see as encirclement. So what they're trying to do is prevent the Houthis from taking over Yemen. and of course, Yemen will be a broken, destitute country at the end of the conflict. At the end of the day, the Saudis are going to bear a lot of that burden anyway, right? Because it's right on their border.
So it's not a beef with Yemen as a country. It's a beef with
correct. Yeah, correct. The Saudis are still supporting the so-called legitimate government of Yemen. the recognized government, the internationally recognized government.
Tom, you mentioned earlier a bit about the Iraq War, that the Saudis saw that coming, and that was a bad idea, and probably counseled us against that. But what was their relationship with Saddam Hussein? What's been what would you say has been the legacy of the U.S. involvement in Iraq as it pertains to Saudi Arabia?
Well, the relationship with Saddam, I actually was in a room one time in Baghdad when Saddam Hussein walked in. And based on that, I can say it'd be very hard to have any kind of relationship with Saddam Hussein other than fear. The Saudis had to do business with the Iraqis at certain levels on certain occasions. For example, after Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel, the meeting of all the other Arabs that threw Egypt out of the Arab fraternity took place in Baghdad, and the Saudis participated in that meeting. That was just at the beginning of Saddam Hussein's time in power. The Saudis, on the other hand, had given refuge to the Kuwaitis when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and of course had backed the Kuwaitis and had given the Americans full facilities to go in there and kick Iraqi butt and get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And in a sense, you could say that they reacted, they did what they had to do, I would say, is how you would put it, right? Iraq under Saddam was an inescapable force, but they were very fearful of it, especially after what happened in Kuwait. And many of them believed the Saudis were next, as the Americans encouraged them to believe. Now, since the invasion of Iraq and the American occupation of Iraq and the Iraq War after the invasion, the last time I discussed this with any Saudis, they basically assigned to the United States and its actions in Iraq a lot of responsibility for the rise of the Islamic State. And had we not invaded Iraq, and had we not gotten rid of Saddam, the Islamic State would not have happened, or at least it would not have taken over. And that may be a simplistic view, but I think they're probably right. And the Islamic State, they were in the crosshairs of the Islamic State. They had their own Al-Qaeda insurgency, which they handled pretty adroitly. But the Islamic State was another force entirely. And they were not pleased with, short after the fall of Saddam, or after we overthrew Saddam, it was quite some time when Saudi Arabia and Iraq didn't even have formal diplomatic relations. That was finally fixed, I think, under King Abdullah late in his rule, but they had a very, very distant relationship, I would say. And then came the Islamic State.
Here's a question thought from a listener. I watched the 2020 documentary film The Dissident, which is about Khashoggi's murder. And it raises many serious questions about whether MBS can be a trusted ally. You touched on this a little bit briefly before. Whether you can trust it or not, he's going to be king at some point in your estimation. So what, the Biden administration is not talking to him now, but sometime they will, or an American administration will have to talk to him. He will be king. What do you make of him? What do you make of MBS?
Well, Secretary Blinken has talked to him. I mean, we're not doing any kind of attempt to ostracize Mohammed bin Salman or cut him out of power in Saudi Arabia. It's not our place to do that. But let's go back a little bit. There were various aspirants to the throne when, or to become crown prince, to become next in line when King Salman became king, including another son of his, who's now the energy minister, now the oil minister, and who is much more experienced and better educated than Mohammed bin Salman. But Mohammed bin Salman had stayed home instead of going to school abroad, had cared for his father, being very close to him, and turned out to be quite ruthless and a relentless bureaucratic infighter within the family. And so I think there comes a point where you stop describing him as young. He's been around a while now. He made a disastrous blunder with the Yemen war. They thought it'd be a cakewalk, and they don't know how to get out of it now. Even the UAE, which was in it with them, has backed away, but the Saudis are still trapped in it. They've made another ceasefire offer just recently. They're looking for a way out, but they've spent billions of dollars that they don't have on a war they can't win, and has alienated a lot of people around the world, including in Washington, where they have no friends in Congress. MBS is impetuous, apparently ruthless, but I frankly am not sure if he's reliable, because I don't know, he made some really terrible decisions. You know, a month before, I knew Jamal Khashoggi. Anybody in this line of work in Washington knew Jamal, right? I had tea with him at his apartment in Jeddah. And about a month before he was murdered, I saw him in Washington. He was having dinner at a table at a restaurant on Connecticut Avenue in Washington. I waved at him as I walked by. There were plenty of opportunities to take out Jamal Khashoggi without doing it in a way that thumbed your nose at the Turks, infuriated President Erdogan, and brought down the wrath of the whole world on you for a crime that was clearly not going to be hideable. I don't understand why they did it that way. It didn't make any sense, and but it really sort of drew back the curtain on the fact that now, I mean, the New York Times has done good reporting on this, as have others, that the Saudis now are, under Mohammed bin Salman, are going after Saudi dissidents abroad, of whom there are more than there ever used to be, and they're going after them by holding their families hostage at home, imprisoning the fathers and sisters of people who speak out against Saudi Arabia. And I have longtime friends in Saudi Arabia. I mean, people who would be the first ones I would go to see. You know, I know them. I've been in their homes, who have told me that if I go to Saudi Arabia now, they can't have the kind of conversations with me that they've had for many years. And so he has imposed an atmosphere of oppression on Saudi Arabia that never existed in the past, at least for men, didn't exist in the past. It's bread and circuses, really, though, is what he's giving them, right? They now have movie theaters, and you can go to co-ed poetry readings if you want, right, in a group. Women don't have to fear being accosted by the so-called religious police, which were really the behavior police anymore. He's lightened up in society, cleverly building domestic support. But as an international partner, he has a long way to go to establish credibility, reliability, and amiability.
Tom, you mentioned that the two original reasons for this unlikely partnership and friendship, Cold War and oil, are not real players anymore, much less players in this. But so somebody asks, what are the principal means of U.S. influence now? Is it they ask about student exchanges, about commercial and business ties? There is still a security desire, I would imagine, but what kinds of leverage does the U.S. have today in this
Well,
relationship?
the Saudis, I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was an episode at, I guess it was Ras Tanura, the huge Saudi oil port on the Gulf. And there was a security threat there from the sea. Very difficult to secure those installations on the seaward side, right? And the Saudis did the only thing they could do. They called the U.S. Navy for help, right? And that remains true, right? It's Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call, right? They don't want to see us leave them to their own resources on the security issues, especially with those huge fleets of Iranian gunboats running around in the Gulf. If you go to the Gulf coast of Saudi Arabia, you will see that from the Kuwaiti border all the way down to the Qatari border, you'll see one huge essential installation after another, either an oil facility of some kind or a water desalination plant, the life of the country. All of them are fat targets for those Iranian missile gunboats. They're sailing around at high speed in the Gulf. The Saudis know our influence over the Saudis. We don't need to be any more influential than that, right? But we don't want to be blunt about it because it's in our interest to keep those facilities going as well, right? We're not going to say to the Saudis, well, if you don't let so-and-so out of prison, we're going to take our ships and go home. No, that is not going to happen. But there is influence to be wielded. We have probably not much direct influence. The Saudi society now, the dominant people in Saudi society, other than the royals, are strong, in general, strongly friendly to the United States. Many of them are educated here. They send their children here to school. Given the choice between the United States and other environments, they pick the United States, right? They like American products. The Saudi cities, except for the way people dress, look like America. There's a McDonald's and a Dunkin' Donuts on every street corner. We've penetrated their culture very deeply. And we have, I would say, they need us at this point more than we need them, except for their intelligence capabilities in penetrating terror networks. And they share with us readily on that. So it ebbs and flows, you know. Someday there might very well be a statesman-like congenial ruler in Saudi Arabia, as there has been in the past. Every American president in his time did business with King Faisal, who was a outspoken, upfront anti-Semite of the worst kind, right? Who else would give Henry Kissinger a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? But Kissinger chose to laugh it off, right? And you can see how the influence works really only at this strategic level. You know, every year for I don't know how long, the State Department has put out that annual report on human rights around the world, and it always flogs the Saudis in strong language for the human rights conditions in Saudi Arabia, and it never matters, right? The Saudis don't let their political prisoners out of jail, except when they think it'll ingratiate them with Washington, as they recently did when they let Lojan al-Haflul out of jail, right? She's never been in jail in the first place, but it takes the heat off. So we do have influence, but as you saw when President Obama convened the, I guess the summit, it was at Camp David, I guess, after the Iran agreement, and got all the GCC countries to sign off on acceptance of the Saudi nuclear agreement, including this, of the Iranian nuclear agreement, including the Saudis. They didn't want to do that, but they couldn't really just come out and say no. And that's sort of the way it works. They do what they have to do, as do we.
Wow, fascinating. You said we need to see the Saudis' actions through Saudi eyes, not American eyes. That's the way you started your presentation. Can you give us a couple of other examples of misinterpretations due to this problem that we have with thinking we're going to take a look at this situation from an American point of view and not a Saudi point of view?
Well, by and large, Americans tend to assume that other countries aspire to be electoral democracies. The Saudis do not aspire to that. And frankly, they have not found an alternative model of governance to the one they have that appeals to them. Kuwait has a parliament, paralyzed the country, right? The United States has Congress, bunch of bozos, right? I mean, why should they do things our way politically? They don't have voting representation, but by and large, the people in Saudi Arabia live secure lives in which they're free to live as they wish, by and large. They can work where they want, live where they want, go to whatever school they can get into. Most of them can travel freely, right? They look at Kuwait and they see endless squabbling that has hobbled the monarchy without advancing the power of the parliament. It doesn't look like an appealing counter model. That's a good example of ways in which you shouldn't assume that the Saudis see things as we do. They have no intention of responding to any appeal on the subject of freedom of religion. Right? I mean, why would they? Islam is the foundation of the state. It's written into what amounts to the Constitution. Right? Some months ago, somebody, in fact, let me just say, advise your audience, right? Never believe anything you read about Saudi Arabia in a British newspaper, except for the Financial Times. And one of the British newspapers had a story saying that the Saudis had reached some agreement to let some group establish a church in Saudi Arabia. There are no churches in Saudi Arabia. There are no synagogues in Saudi Arabia. Guess what? That story wasn't true, right? They're not going to have freedom of religion. And as far as I can tell, they don't want it, right? It's a devoutly Muslim society. So they just don't, they don't view their lives the way we would expect them to. The subject of women is one on which we could do a whole other session. And my own knowledge of that now needs to be refreshed. I need to go out there and go back and see all my female friends and talk to them about it.
Well, we got a question here about a person in Saudi history, Sheikh Zaki Yamani.
Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani,
who passed away just last month, played in a critical role in the 1973 oil embargo. The listener is asking you to comment on how important a player he was, with special reference to U.S. foreign policy relating to oil, in addition to Israel.
Yamani is like any non-royal power player in Saudi Arabia. He was important until he wasn't. One day, Yamani was the world famous oil minister, wheeling and dealing at the highest level. The next day, he was out on his burnous. Why? Because he and the king had some disagreement, right? They don't have, whether it's Yamani or any equivalent non-royal prominent member of the cabinet or over there, they don't have individual constituencies as individuals. Okay. He was a very important player. He was a smooth operator. He was delightful to talk to. I met him first when he was in Washington, and he was a luncheon guest of Katharine Graham's at the Washington Post. I got invited to that lunch, right? I interviewed him at a crucial OPEC meeting in Doha. I got to know him. He was a very smooth operator. He was extremely powerful within OPEC and within the circle of oil until he wasn't. He was well known in Washington, liked. He was well liked. He spoke flawless English from his time at NYU. One day he was no longer of any importance.
Tom, you made an interesting side comment by saying that Saudis don't have any friends in U.S. Congress. It'd be interesting to follow up on why that is. And in fact, our council is going to be interviewing the Saudi ambassador to the United States on Tuesday, April 13 at noon. Go to worldmichigan.org to sign up for that program. Her Royal Highness, Rima, and the first woman U.S. first Saudi ambassador as a woman in any country. She has been appointed the U.S. ambassador. So it appears that Saudi Arabia is trying to do something it maybe hasn't done ever, trying to reach out to average Americans. But
it's about damn time. Look, my take on this, let's use a good example. Remember what happened on JASTA. I forget what the acronym stands for now, but it's the law that allows Americans who were victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts. Normally, because of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, you can't sue a foreign country or its leaders in a U.S. court unless that country is on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which of course Saudi Arabia is not. JASTA was an act of Congress during the Obama administration that allowed Americans to sue Saudi Arabia. Obama vetoed the bill, and his veto was overridden by massive majorities in both houses of Congress, 434, 3-2 or something like that, right? Because nobody in Congress has anything to lose by voting against Saudi Arabia, right? Except for Americans who worked for Aramco or otherwise spent time in the kingdom and developed contacts there. By and large, Americans don't care about the Saudis. People one way or another don't have any ties to them, cultural, historical, literary, right? You don't, and there's going all the way back to the OPEC days, their treatment of women. They were not going to be popular with the American people across the board. Now, and Princess Rima's father, Prince Bandar, during all the years when he was ambassador here, was extremely well placed in Washington and knew everybody in Washington, including President Bush. But he did, and even though he had a beautiful house in Aspen, he didn't do much in the way of contacts with the American people. And I've always thought that the Saudis should stop wasting millions of dollars on useless PR, taking out full-page ads in foreign affairs is not going to influence the Americans favorably. What they should do was have an ambassador who would get out there and do the Rotary Club's circuit and the World Affairs Council. And now Princess Rima seems willing and able and ready to do that. And I wish her luck, because there are a lot of people ask me if I like Saudi Arabia. Heavens no, I don't like it as a society or the way they run their country. but there are wonderful people in Saudi Arabia, and you can do well there in purely human terms, whom you know and who you're friends with. And I wish Princess Rima luck in getting out and establishing to the American people that the Saudis are not monsters or ogres. They're just like actual human beings. You know, they get up every morning and they go to work and send their kids to school and watch TV, right? And they're not raving religious fanatics with scimitars between their teeth. I wish Rima luck doing this. It's long overdue.
Yeah, we'll send you the link, Tom. Maybe you can look in on April 13th.
I will. I absolutely will.
We'll send you the link because April 13th at noon she'll be our guest. That'd be fascinating. Somebody's asking what your opinion is on Biden's response to the murder of Khashoggi. You know, he released the full report. That the full report had not been released prior to Biden being president, but that's about all he's done there. Do you think that was what else might he do? Do you think that's going to end there?
Beats me. I mean, so far during his brief tenure in office, Biden has made it a point not to demonstrate passion about anything. And so certainly we can all agree on that it was a deplorable atrocity, what happened to Khashoggi, and he wouldn't dispute that. And he's made his position clear that he, unlike President Trump, he's not going to repudiate the findings of his intelligence community or reject them. But beyond that, all he's done is made clear that he's not himself going to talk to Mohammed bin Salman. And that's not the only reason. The Khashoggi case is not the only reason. Yemen is a big part of it also, and there are other issues. So there are other people to whom the Khashoggi case is a more urgent cause than it appears to be to President Biden.
Maybe final question here, Tom, and then we'll wrap up our conversation. But are the Saudis helping the Taliban? There's some reports that they might be or are. Do you know anything about that? Are they inclined to do that? Is it in their interest to do that?
I can't imagine. Look, everybody knows that Al Qaeda's first target was the Saudi royal family, right? And they gave the Saudis a healthy fear of Islamist extremism, especially when it's accompanied by or spread by violence, as the Taliban do. The potential links to the Taliban go back to the original war in Afghanistan, when the people of Afghanistan rose against the Soviet occupiers, and the United States and the Saudis together backed the opponents of the Soviets and of the secular government in Afghanistan. I have no doubt that members of what is today the Taliban participated in that conflict on the side of and with some of the aid of the Saudis and of the United States. This is Charlie Wilson's War, right? A great book and a great movie. But to me, it's inconceivable that it would be the policy of the Saudi government to provide aid to the Taliban in any direct way that would be inimical to the United States. Right? Beyond that, to tell you the truth, I've given up on Afghanistan, so I don't read much about it.
Tom, this has been delightful. I have learned so much, and I think our listeners have too. And we could talk for longer. There are more questions, but we're going to have to wrap this up and let you go. I mentioned this book that you put together that talked about the Onassis deal, that whole affair. You've got another one. You were telling me the other day about another one that you were going to recommend to our
Yes,
listeners.
give me 1 second here.
By the way, there's a link to Tom's book on our website if you want to take a look at how to track this book down and get it. Crude Oil, Crude Money.
The whole story I told at the beginning about the origins of this relationship, going back to the new church, going back to the Reformed Church doctors, and through all of it, oil, agriculture, American involvement in Saudi agriculture, all the things we taught them when we had our civil servants over there, the TWA, the role of TWA in developing the airline, was all put together in a book called Inside the Mirage, a cheap title from the marketing department, by the way. You should avoid the Mirage image. But if you want to retrace that whole story, that's where you'll find it.
That's awesome. And if some of our listeners want to follow what you're doing and writing, is there a way that they can track your latest articles or the latest things that you're up to, Tom?
Well, I do have a website, www.tomlippman.net. I don't post there much, but you can see the things I've written in the last couple of years. And I also have an Amazon author link. If you just go look me up on Amazon, you'll find the author link with biographical information and so on.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I'm sure some of our listeners are going to do that. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for being with us tonight, Tom, and really appreciate this. Those of you in the West Michigan area, if you want to continue this dialogue on Saudi-U.S. relations, we have our Wednesday night global mixer at 7 p.m. You register at worldmichigan.org/Great Decisions 2021, and we'll be talking more about what Tom had to say and about Saudi Arabia. And we do that in a more casual setting and the like. And again, on Tuesday, April 13 at noon, we are going to host Her Royal Highness Ambassador Rima Bandar, and she will be our guest to talk about Saudi-U.S. relations. And Tom will be listening, and we hope you will too. Go to worldmichigan.org to find out how to register for that very, very interesting program. Thank you so much.